For those of you joining me on the video right now, I apologize that I skipped the first moment. The key thing that I've done is I've drawn a layer called section A-A, and I've put in a line on that layer representing a section line. So the key thing is we've got a 3D model with the actual site and various things on it, and we'll eventually move things to different layers if need be. Okay, now everyone in the video is up to scratch with us. Okay, so key thing here is we want to actually generate two types of objects to do this attractive section. The first being an actual vector cut through our site, through our design, and the second being a render that we can then drop in behind. And Zach, I believe, did something similar for his first presentation. So we'll do something similar. But Zach, did you use Illustrator or did you just use the straight render?
I use Photoshop.
Okay, so we'll use Illustrator in this case. So what we'll do is we're going to select all the objects that we are going to cut through, and excluding the section line. We'll type section. That's going to then ask us for various options. The key thing here is we probably want extend section set to yes. We also want assign layers by input object, which is very useful. And we also probably want to group objects by the section plane, yes. All very useful options. So then if we select a start and end point for our section cut, that will cut through our objects and produce a section line that is grouped, and if I just pull this up to the side, each of the objects in that group are going to be assigned the layer that object was on, okay? So we can already see here, because I drew all of this on the one layer, things are going to be a bit iffy. But if I redo this and I make sure that my ground layer is on a my ground object is on the ground layer, change that, and we run that process again, we can see that line is now on that layer. And that's going to make it a lot easier when we take this into Illustrator to make it work. So when you bake your grasshopper objects, you want to start actually thinking about how you bake them and where you bake them to, onto which layer, so that it can help you do processes like this. Okay? So one really useful component that I'm not going to talk you through, but it's one that automates baking, because no one here is actually automating their baking, I'm imagining. Nope, okay. Elephant and human both have components that allow you to bake automatically. And you can assign layers to them to bake. So you can see here, it's this little bread layer object here. This bakes objects. You put geometry in, attributes. So if you grab an attribute like so, you can assign a layer name to the object, and then those objects that are in that bake component will bake to that layer. Just a nice little useful way of automating the baking. Okay. So this particular object here eventually needs to get into Illustrator, and Illustrator really only wants to think in one plane. What plane would you think that needs to be? Monica? What did you say? Oh, you're so confident, and then I single you out. Go on, you can be wrong. The plane? 2D. So what plane is that?
It can be X, Y, Y, Z.
So it's going to be the XY plane. Yes, but we need, if we export anything out of Rhino into Illustrator, it needs to be XY plane. because if we export it in any other plane, it'll flatten it to the XY plane. Yeah. So see this object here, it's in 3D, it's in a non-XY plane. We effectively need to rotate this 90 degrees, actually the other way. So what I've done is I've just right-clicked rotate on the right here. By right-clicking, you're doing a 3D rotate. Then if you draw from the left to right of your section, then you can rotate minus 90 degrees, and that will then flip that up the right way, and we'll just push that up. Okay? You okay, Tim? Good. What's your gaming center telling you? You're doing well? Okay, so we got to get this out of Rhino into Illustrator. Fortunately, Rhino exports straight to Illustrator files. So if I go File, Export Selected, I can select AI as the actual file type. So let's call this section. And when it asks you, well, what scale do you actually want this thing? We need to actually set this to preserve a model scale, because we like working in scales. And if we lose, we don't actually know what the scale is if it just does a snapshot of the current view, okay? So we need to know what the scale is.
Graphics.
Pardon?
The scale, graphic scale. They could use the graphic scale too.
You mean like a detail layout? Yeah, you could use that, but if your scale's 2.325 to 1, it's quite difficult, right? So a little trick is if you turn on preserve model scale and set that to millimeters, most people, when we think about a scale drawing, we think 1 to 100, 1 to 500, 1 to 1,000. To get this to be a scale, we need to type in the opposite. So 100 to 1 is taking a real life drawing, 1 to 1, and putting it to 1 to 100, okay? So the important reason that you need to do this is Illustrator thinks in millimeters, and it thinks in paper space and web pixel space. It doesn't want to design something larger than 20 meters, right? It wants to do little pages, and we have to basically convert everything to a scale that it wants to think in for that to work, okay? So most of you probably need at least 1 to 200 to fit your buildings on an A3 page, I would say. That's a nice scale. 1 to 200 is a nice safe scale. We regularly work between 1 to 5, 1 to 2, 1 to 5 for residential details and commercial details, through to 1 to 100, 1 to 200 for residential plans, maybe commercial tower plans, depends on how big they are. I regularly work in 1 to 750 and 1 to 1,500 because I'm working on stadiums. So the bigger the buildings, the larger the scale needs to be. And urban planning, which I believe you guys are doing with Rob and Lucy, they're usually working in 1 to 5,000, 1 to 10,000, 1 to 20,000, okay? So just be mindful of that. And obviously if you're drawing something in meters, this doesn't actually have meters in its options, right? So if I was drawing something in meters, what is 1 to 1 in meters? One unit in the model equals 1 millimeter. Does it work in meters?
It does.
Okay, excellent. Then yeah, you just do the same. No, it would say 1 meter equals 1 mil. That's 1 to 1,000. Okay, so you just got to divide everything by that for it to work.
Also light ones in there, right?
Yeah, there's also light years and parsecs. Okay, so let's do ours at 1 to 200, just to be safe. And we'll set OK. And let's open up Illustrator.
If it's too small, you can always scale up.
Yes. So you guys, just be careful though. So a lot of people think, okay, if something's vector, you can just scale it up or scale it down. But there's a problem sometimes when it comes to accuracy. So if you make something too small, what happens is when you import something into Illustrator, do you remember the honey thing? When you bring something into Illustrator, it's going to truncate the numbers. And so if you scale it up, it might not be as accurate. So you want to aim for the right scale. You can scale things up and down, but just be mindful that you might make your file sizes too big or you might lose accuracy. And we are going to go open this.
What I used to do actually, when I didn't know the scale, was just to make an A3 in scale on the Rhino.
Yeah. No, it's quite useful. This is actually what I do as well. So I go and say, let's go find a 3-page size. Now, just remember, you guys aren't even using pages. You're not even using pages, but it's a nice, it's a good scale to work to, I guess, A3. So we can see here it's 297 by 420. So if I draw that in, scale it up by 200, I can see how big my drawing's going to be on A3, okay? So I probably only need that to be 1 to 100 in my case, maybe not even 1 to 50. No, 1 to 100 is good. Yeah? Okay? So I'm going to re-export this. I can even re-export it with the outline at 1 to 100. Okay, so let's go, where did I save that? In one of the weirdest places ever. So bringing this into Illustrator, Illustrator doesn't know the page size that you wanted to work with, and it doesn't know most things. It will always basically refer to your 0 point as the bottom left corner of the page that it defines, right? So if your model is far away from origin, which I doubt most of yours will be, unless you're using the survey that I gave you, if your model's been drawn far away, then it might actually break Illustrator. It will go off the page, okay? It'll disappear and you'll have to re-export your Illustrator file, your Illustrator file from Rhino closer to the origin, okay? So another little trick there is if you go File, Export Selected, instead of Export Selected, Export with Origin, you can pick a new origin for your file, and that will be the fixed point. So let's try that one. Please work. If this doesn't work, then screw you, Rhino. Yeah, it worked. Okay, so who here is very familiar with Illustrator? No one? Louis? Okay, so here's some important things with Illustrator. It's probably the best place that you can create vector drawings for printing or display. Okay, a lot of people will say drawing in Revit or drawing in AutoCAD, it creates better drawings, but you're usually working blind. Those programs don't actually show you the true thickness of the lines that you're working to, and they use old school techniques for defining line weights, okay? So you probably haven't noticed this, and you will only probably notice this until you start working with more traditional style architects. But if you open an AutoCAD file, a documentation file, there will be a certain number of colors being used. There'll be red, yellow, blue, green, cyan, and black or white. Like those are those colors. Is this confirming? So those colors are directly representing line thicknesses. So usually red will be thinner than yellow, and yellow will be thinner than blue, and blue will be thinner than cyan. Okay, and they get thicker and thicker as you sort of look at the table. These are actually directly related to pen thicknesses on old school plotters. Do you guys know old school plotters?
Oh, cute, not knowing.
I won't say pen. These are really new versions, but it works very much like a CNC machine. This is actually how architects used to print their drawings prior to inkjet printers being cheap. They would have CNC machines that would hold pens with very specific thicknesses, and just like a laser cutter, they would draw the lines for the drawing. That's how architects used to print. I've never ever seen one of these in an office. This is before my time. It's probably before Julia's time as well.
We're only a couple of years.
I don't know what it's like in Italy.
I told you that the world hasn't changed that much between 84 and 87.
Yeah. Okay, so this is how architects used to plot, which is interesting because nowadays a lot of architects don't actually care about double lines. Like, with laser cutting, if you had more than one line on top of each other, you could possibly cause a fire, or your print takes 30 minutes longer because of all the double lines. Architects really used to care about nice, clean line drawings, because if they drew multiple lines on top of each other, the pen would just draw over the same spot over and over again, and it would tear the paper, right? If you get a texture and you mark it down 100 times, the paper will fall apart. That's what used to happen. And so people used to really care about CAD drafting standards. Then inkjet printers came out, then laser cutters came out, and everyone had forgotten that skill set in that time, and then fires got caused. So the key thing here is most people are working blind. Illustrator gives us the exact weight of the line that we're using, and we can see it live and confirm whether or not it's a thickness that we want. Fortunately, Illustrator will bring in the layers that we've drawn, as long as we've drawn them on layers. So this little icon on the right here, I'm sorry, my resolution is very high. I'm going to set it to quite low. Pardon? Does it work now? Is that better? Can you see this little icon? Layers? Okay, if you can't access layers, then you can access layers from Window Layers. Sorry, Louis. Do you want to teach? You sure? I'm sure you might actually know more than me about this. Okay. So, the beautiful thing about this is if you maintain the things that you want with certain thicknesses on their layers, then they will stay on that layer, and you can just select everything on that layer. There are shortcuts for selecting things on layers, but I'll avoid them for now because they can be a bit troublesome. So first thing we want to do, we'll go to Document Setup in the top, and we will want to edit Artboards. That will allow us to change the layout of the page. Do not, by default, there is a little button up here called Move Copy Artwork with Artboard. If you turn that off, you can then move your artboard around like a crop and orient where your art sits on the page. And we can play with the landscape and set this thing to A3 in that top bar. Okay? Generally, we want one Illustrator document per drawing. You don't really want, like if you do more than one in one drawing, it gets really messy and it's hard to work with other people. and it gets heavy. It's more so the size. If you can separate your files, it's probably better. You can always share styles between files.
Unless it's a set of different
True,
diagrams
yeah.
on top of the same, then you want to keep it.
Unless they will work as the one
So
drawing.
when you export, there'll always be the presentation in the same position and they don't click.
So we're going to do an architectural drawing style section. So we probably want all the lines to be black, okay?
All great.
All grayscale for now. And so what this green layer, we're going to hide
Fancy.
we're going to hide the default layer, just showing the ground. So we can select the ground, and then under the stroke settings, so which is this little icon on the right, or if you go window and scroll down under S for stroke, there you can see the weight of the stroke. And some of you may note, what unit does your stroke use?
0.001. So,
What unit does it use? Yours uses millimeters? Not everyone uses points, but who's got a stroke that says PT? Yeah, most people? Okay. I prefer millimeters because I buy pens with millimeter widths, okay? I understand my pens and my thicknesses as millimeters. Other people, like graphic designers, they like working with points. And a point, you know when you set your font to 10 or 11 or 12 in Word, that's referring to a point, okay? And so it's usually relative to a font size. I prefer millimeters. If you want to change yours to mils, if you go Edit, Preferences, and go to, I believe it is Units, you can see under here, you can set your stroke to millimeters. You're right. By default, it's points. So that now allows me to set a thickness for my line in mils, and I'm going to set it to 0.5 millimeters. A real thick ground line, okay? We want a strong. You want even more? Okay, let's do it. 1 mil. One's pretty thick. One's a thick line. And we can either change in the top left here or on the bottom mid left the stroke color. So we can pull up a stroke picker and it'll pick out black. Cool? So that's actually visually how thick that line's going to be on the page. Most people think that programs like AutoCAD and Rhino actually show them the right thickness because there are settings that allow you to show thicknesses, but they only show a limit of 1 pixel, 2 pixel, 3 pixel sizes. They don't anti-alias between it, whilst Illustrator does. So that's why my go-to is Illustrator. So here, if we turn our default layer back on, we can go into that and pick out the objects in that layer and apply a stroke weight for them as well. So in this case, these are walls. We probably want at least maybe like a 0.2 mil thickness. And another thing is a lot of architects, depending on the style that you're going for, you probably want to go for rather vague. If you've got closed polylines like this, then you can also set, instead of setting a thickness at all to your stroke, you can get rid of the stroke and fill your closed objects with just solid black. Okay, so what that means is, quite quickly, I've got a relatively sensible looking section here, although apart from the fat ceiling, that's giving me an understanding of what's solid and what's open. I can see there is a window here, yeah? And there is the ground line, and the ground line might actually need to be fattened even more, or potentially We might even draw the ground line as a solid block of black to give a sense of solid to it. Now, just remember graphic styles. You can be a bit creative with your graphic styles. So, for example, someone who had an anime film might actually start bringing in some like painterly looking effects for their sections to try and tie in with their theming. Okay, you can be really. This is probably the very default of what is considered to be an architectural section. Okay, but even though we've done a section in Rhino, what it hasn't done and what most sections actually require is for what is beyond the camera to be visible, okay? Most sections show the elevation behind. Now, Rhino has tools that allow you to create vector versions of that called Make 2D. Have you guys been playing around with Make 2D?
Yes.
So I don't need to talk about it today? No? We don't need to do Make 2D today? Because Make 2D is quite messy, I find. Then Rhino 6 works quite well with meshes. But it's messy, and I actually...
It's very messy.
Yeah. And I actually find for visual presentations, most of my perspective, my section drawings, I'll actually go and render the background, okay? So that means I'll go into 3ds Max and use V-Ray and render it. Today we're not going to use that, we'll just use Rhino, seeing as you've all got it. So...
If they have 6, they can export.
Huh?
If they have 6, they can export the Arctic visual style. It's already available.
Yeah, no, the rendered style's great. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a clipping plane. We're going to make sure it's vertical, and we're going to draw that clipping plane in the exact same position as our section. So now if I go into rendered mode, we can see that is slicing through our object. Cool. So how do we get our view to match our section? It's difficult, right? You guys don't actually know how to do that. So what we're going to do, we're going to move our section up, and we are going to create a seaplane. Everyone's familiar with seaplanes? No? How about you, Curtis? No? Okay. So seaplane, I was almost tempted to go over there and draw on your face. No. So if I type seaplane, what that is a coordinate plane. It's very much like the planes that we get in Grasshopper, except what it does is it reorients the coordinate system that you're working in the Rhino environment. So 0 is actually going to move relative to where we draw. So once I type seaplane, if I select 3 point, which in Rhino 6 is selected with a P, I can draw 1, 2, and 3, being the origin, the X direction, and the Y direction. And that then allows me, when I type plan, that will give me a view orthogonal to that clipping plane. Okay? And some of you, maybe your clipping plane is oriented in the wrong direction. If you select the clipping plane and you pull up the properties, then under clipping plane, we can flip the direction that'll show us the other way. Okay? So that's after selecting that clipping plane, properties, and the clipping plane props.
Can you put a window?
There is a window.
No, another one on the...
There's a window over here.
Yeah, one on the face.
Yeah, so hang on, we'll get there. Okay. So, I don't like normal sections, I like section perspectives. Okay? Is this drawing a perspective drawing or an orthographic drawing? It's orthographic, right? So under properties, if I don't have anything selected, that gives me the properties of the viewport. Is everyone okay? Everyone's falling asleep. Okay, good. So under the properties, when nothing's selected, that gives us the view properties. And we can see here projection is set to parallel or orthographic. We can set that to perspective. And as long as we don't rotate the view, it should be aligned to what we've drawn. So we don't want to rotate. If we rotate, there's this little undo view changes just here. All we're allowed to do at the moment is hold shift and pan. As long as we do that, everything should stay oriented to that view. So that allows us to pan and orient a nice little section perspective render. And what I want to do is just get enough of the shadow to include in my drawing. Okay? Now, we could go absolutely crazy, and I'm going to do that. If I go to set view, there is a function here called dolly zoom, and that allows me to do effectively increase the lens focus of the shot and give it a lot more depth to it, a lot more. It's that style that they use. You know that style in Jaws where they pull the focus. It's like that. Basically, relatively, it's the same scale, but it's just giving it a bit more depth. Yeah. Cool. Now we want to get rid of these curves in the background. So under the display options, which you can find if we pull up properties, right-click the panel, you can find the display functions. In here, we can turn off the curves. We can also turn off clip. Yeah, we can turn off. If your clipping plane is in shot, we can turn off clipping plane. And we've got a fairly nice shot, right? It's quite nice, yeah? So, let's do a view capture to file. So type that in. And that will then give us options for which view we want, whether we want the grid shown or we want a transparent background. So in this case, I do want a transparent background. It could be quite useful. We can even set the resolution. So I can set this quite high, which is really useful. It just means it takes a little bit longer. And then if I set OK, that will allow me to go drop this. I'm just going to go put it on my desktop. Now, if I've got a transparent background, do not save it as a JPEG because JPEGs can't have transparency. We want to save it as PNGs. If you want to live life on the super professional, I'm a graphic designer, I'm so hip and cool with my cool images, you can use TIFFs, but we're not. Cool, so that saved the PNG. So now, if I go back to Illustrator, if I go to a new layer, so under the layer properties, we go new. So that's created a layer 3. We want to drag that to be under our other layers. We can then go File, Place, and pick out the image that we've saved, in my case, on the desktop. What did I call it? Was it called background? Okay, so that will then allow us to place that, and then from that we need to scale it into position. I believe there is a shortcut to doing this. If you find a point in your file that is relatively aligned, so you align it, then you click Alt Shift maybe? No. if we go to the transform tool, I've forgotten how to do it. Drat. You can scale things from a new point. Huh? Not a center point. A random point. I believe there is a scale tool here. We don't want that one. This one. Here we go. With scale on, if you pick a point, so if you hold Alt and then click, that will define a point that you want to scale from. And from there, with preview set to on, you can then play with the scale of the image until it locks into place, okay? These just have to look good. They don't have to be perfect, okay? Just make it look good. So in this case, I just need it to be 63%, and that's dropped into place. So we're starting to see a fairly nice section, right? We've got an image that we can control with in the background, and we've also got vector work that we can play with in the front. So I can select my default lines here, and I can play with the fact that they're filled with white. We can basically play with the graphic style in Illustrator now. Or if you want, bring your Illustrator file into Photoshop and play with it there. Your choice, okay? One key thing here is, if you legitimately own Illustrator, you probably also legitimately own Photoshop, yeah? So if you if you select your image, you'll note that image is going to be listed in the links tab, which you can find under window links. So that if your file changes, your links file, the background file changes, it will update in your Illustrator drawing, okay? So just consider that. That means I can actually edit that image, in Photoshop, and it will update in my Illustrator drawing, okay? So let us do that. So I'm going to give this a bit of dynamism, actually a bit of flavor, a bit of color. And the quick and easy way of doing that is making all the shadows a little bit blue and making all the whites a little bit orange. Just so, we've got a bit of sunlight coming through, it's got a bit of an orange tinge, and we've got a bit of sky causing a bit of shadow, giving it a little bit of a blue tinge, okay? So quick and easy way in Photoshop is with a layer, an overlay. So it's this little black and white, it's this little black and white button down here to add one. If we click that, we can find in there a color balance tool. With that, we can play with the shadows and make them a little bit cyan and a little bit blue. And you can see there that's starting to get a bit of a cold tint. And if we go to the highlights and make them a little bit red and a little bit yellow, that's making the lighter colors a bit warmer. And we can also start playing around with the levels. So we could make things darker or brighter if required. Just do that in Photoshop. Use Photoshop for what it's good at, dealing with raster editing, and use Illustrator for what it's good at, playing around with vectors. Yeah. Pardon? No, that's okay. No, these guys aren't printing from Illustrator. We're going to web, right? But yes, he's right. We only ever want to print from PDF, basically. That's probably the best thing to print from. So if you're ever going to go to a print shop, export everything that you've done into PDF before you go. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to save this. Now, if I save it as a PNG, it should update in Illustrator. Yes, update. And we can see there that that's now begun, like it's got the tinting that we've put in. But as well, what you might want to do is save this as a PSD and place the PSD into the Illustrator document instead, because that means as you edit your Photoshop document, it'll update in Illustrator. You don't need to save it out as a PNG from now on, okay? Last thing, let's add some little features to our design. We're going to add another layer. Let's call this one shadow. In here, we're going to draw a new object. And what we'll do is say, here is a shadow cast from the sun coming into our room. And we can play with the properties of how that looks using transparency. In here, we can set this to shadow at 20%. Cool. So what we can then do is try and match that same line down here. And if we have that object selected, you can use this eyedropper tool to pick other objects with the same styling and give them that same look. So that usually works a lot better with non-section perspectives, because you can see this technically needs to be more like that. Because we're actually casting a shadow on the ground, blah, blah, blah. You guys can go nuts when it comes to, producing realistic images. Hence why using, like if you set up all your sun work and whatnot in the rendering tool, then it'll, You've never done this? Too much paint? But it's good, it looks good, doesn't it? That actually looks pretty reasonable. So we want people and we want trees, right? So let's go get some people. I find it really difficult finding people on the internet, like silhouette people, because there's far too many websites who give out free silhouette people, and they just go get I feel like they just go get pornography pictures and trace them. I swear. I kind of want to show you. The problem is when you find one, like see that one. I bet I know, like they got that from a specific website. Like they've traced an image of someone from fairly dodgy places. But just be careful. Like these ones. Look at this. Like look at this one. Okay, so I'm right. Good. So what we want to do, let's just go, here we go, this one looks vect easy. Let's go steal some people. The problem is they just aren't, they're usually weird. This one's pretty good. Fat Silhouettes looks good. Premium, they're all premium.
You don't have Illustrator?
No, I don't. I personally don't have it on this machine. Hang on, let's try this.
There's a
I'm
website that's pretty good.
going to steal it.
What is that?
I'm going to steal them.
Okay.
So I'm going to save a dude, we'll save him to the desktop. If you really want to steal vectors like silhouettes, they're super easy to steal. So in Illustrator, if you set file place and you select your image, so let's go get the person, and we use image trace, that will produce like a vector version of your image. You can play with the settings in here. This is literally like a semester's work of teaching you guys Illustrator crammed into like a few hours, less than an hour. So once that's traced, if you expand it and then right-click and ungroup it, that will let you pick just the black zones, leaving us just with, and deleting the white ones, leaving us with a nice little silhouette dude. And we can then place him into our model.
Flat icon.
Okay. Oh, flat, really?
Yeah, flat icon. It should be free
and that will then allow us to scale our dude to the right size. Okay? Really? It's usually just like icons, isn't it?
There should be silhouettes as well. Probably better just for
These look good. Free pick. Feel free to cut people out from your movie, you know, silhouette them. It's easy to trace these things. As things move away from a camera, remember that they shrink, but they probably want to maintain like a similar eye level to other people, or otherwise it looks a bit weird. He looks a bit weird. If it looks weird, it's weird. Just scale it up to make it look good. And
another trick, if you don't know how to scale people properly, just put a little stick in your Rhino model.
Yeah.
Where you know that your tree or your person will go. So 1.7 for a person, 3.5 for a tree, and then you're gonna just cover it with your silhouette. Not the usual jacaranda?
No, I want to use these. These are cool. So we want to add some trees. Let's go. Oh, this game's so beautiful. So let's go steal some Ivan L style trees. So I'm going to pull these into Photoshop before, because we want these to have some opacity to them. So you could be limited to your skill set being literally just using the magic wand to pick out your stuff, or polygon tools, but fortunately for me, these trees seem to just be silhouettes. So what I can do is use color range to pick out that and isolate them, set them as a solid color. Let's use something other than black for now, just to test that it's working. Yep, that works. So if I get rid of the background and I set my solid color to, let's make it a little bit green. Then we have the ability to cut these particular trees out into new files. Ah, jeez. Let's just crop it. Cropping it. Come on, locking. Cool. Saving it. Let's save it as a PSD. So tree1.psd. And then that gives us the ability to put a layer above our background, because you can see this is causing an issue.
That you can fix in.
Yeah. And we can then place our tree. Oop. And our other one will go behind, so we'll put that behind the background layer. Oop. So go back there, make it a little bit bigger. So we're starting to get like a nice little scene for our section, right? It didn't take long, and I've taken a section that looked literally like this and made it presentable, okay? This has effort put into it. It's communicating an atmosphere to your design, and obviously you're going to take steps that are going to make, like for example, Blade Runner, you probably do a night shot, that type of scene, yeah? Or those of you who are doing things underwater, you know, put in a layer, make it blue, and actually show where the water is. Oh, this one, what's going on here? Is my color scale set to
No, I think it's just that. There.
What are you trying to show me?
Oh yes, of course, I'm sure.
What are you trying to cook? You know, make it blue. Like, make it look like it's underwater. Oh, there you go. Cool. If you need things to be slightly transparent, as if you're using cellophane, you under opacity as transparency, you set the transparency style to multiply. That means as it lays over things, it will show through the dark elements below. Okay, and that's I can't teach you everything about Illustrator and Photoshop in one day. Okay, but just to show off. These are some illustrations that we have done for a book that is being produced for the Singapore work that we've done. If it downloads. Download. Yeah, it doesn't have viruses. I didn't put any viruses in it. We're gonna have to wait a bit. So, a lot of effort was put into these drawings to make them presentable for a book, for a publication. And you guys have to consider that your design is unfortunately represented by the drawings that are presented to us, okay? You could have a fantastic design, but if you can't communicate it to us well, then how are we going to see how good it is? Okay, it's unfortunate that that is part of the life that we're in. I struggled with that for 5 years, doing what I thought was, putting a lot of effort into the design work and very little effort into the representation. And more so, when I say that, I didn't communicate my designs clearly. I put a lot of effort into the renders, but not much into actually explaining the design. And there's a balance in the design, the communication, and the representation. So please, how big is this thing? 5 gig. Fuck. Okay, let's cancel that.
Don't have a preview that you sent to some.
Yeah, I've got some previews, Tim. So there's just simple little drawings here, like diagrams showing elevations and plans of these real life things, through to more elaborate elevations. What are we doing? So you can see this particular one. You can see the line work there is quite sharp, even though it's fuzzy because of the quality of the export. But can you see that this has kind of like a little bit of a chrome look to it? That's because I rendered this, rendered the actual metal finish to put into the illustration to give it the sense that it is like a metallic finish, because that's the real thing in reality. And if I'd left it flat in the elevation, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't represent the outcome. And we actually had to make the design thicker for this larger elevation, just because how the reality of how thin it was, it just didn't show up. And so we had to play with the reality of it. Yeah, this guy, jeez. Playing League of Legends. He's a bit of a weirdo. This is the Helix Bridge. We can see we've done an orthographic elevation, an orthographic section here, so it doesn't have perspective to it. But then what we've had to do is actually fade out what's in behind, because it's just far too complicated and messy, and it draws away from the actual section. So there's a lot of decisions have been made about putting in a thick black line to help encourage people see a pathway through, even though there isn't a thick black line on the design. So just be mindful that these don't have to be representing your reality. They can have some artistic, poetic licensing to them to communicate your ideas to us. Okay? I really want to show you guys the master plan, but it's not in this set. Is it? No. It's not. Oh well. Where could I find it? This is actually probably super interesting to you guys. This is better. No. $1.2 gigs. Okay, can't show you this week. Sorry. But I will show you guys some stuff next year where we actually have begun to automate the drawings that we create in Illustrator and Photoshop using Grasshopper. So instead of we only have to do some of this work once, and then we push data from Grasshopper into Photoshop, and then it just updates live. Huh?
Thicknesses.
Yeah, all of that stuff.
Yeah, same.
Everything. So it's quite a beautiful process because a lot of people spend a lot of time making illustrations in our business, it actually takes, unfortunately, half the time we spend talking to the client, and the other half the time we spend communicating to the client, and 0% of our time is usually spent actually doing design.
Thinking about design between 1 meeting.
Yeah, so if we can reduce some of that process, then we can actually have some time to design, which is really good. Cool. Okay, and maybe I'll bring in the drawing next week, and I can demonstrate that to you because it's actually quite cool. Cool. Thanks, guys. We've got an hour, so let's do it. Let's go.